Has that come up yet? I think it's come up. I've started it. It should say in a moment. There we go. You are all now in a recorded meeting. Just so you know. We've already done the first box. I'm moving on the second. Don't worry, I'll go through them at the end as well. But it pioneered these sewers in Bradford. No longer a hole, sad to say. It used to be my favourite joke. So yes, absolutely. Good. We've got loads of stuff here. What else does the government do? Or what's the link with the philanthropists? Emily mentioned rich people doing something, but as yet we haven't got any rich people names to shame the government into action, to force them to do what they were doing. Can anyone remember? Maybe if I gave a date. Let's start with 1842. What gets published in 1842?
Report living conditions.
Not living conditions, not specifically, but it is about
sewage.
Report on labouring poor. Basically saying that they cannot live properly. Who came up with this report?
Chadwick.
It's Chadwick. Good old Chadders. Edwin Chadwick. Never met a girl like you before. That's Edwin Collins, but it's close enough to Edwin Chadwick. What does it result in? What does it force and shame the government into doing? Because he proves that people die earlier and poor people in particular die earlier than everybody else, but people die earlier in cities because the conditions are so bad. What does it shame the government into doing? Because he totally does. Again, if I give a date, that might be helpful. This leads directly to, I'll just put an arrow, the 1848 one.
Public Health Act.
It's another Public Health Act. What's different about this Public Health Act, the 1875 one? If it was passed in 1848, why does it need to be passed again? What's special about this one? It does all the same things, but...
Was it because of cholera, like it meant the government could charge the like the local boards of health if there were too many deaths due to poor water?
All of this stuff here, you're dead right, all of this is passed in, but why do they need to pass it again in 1875? Why is that the big one if they do it in 1848?
Is it not like necessary, like they don't have to follow it?
Go on, what do you call it when you don't have to follow it? Don't worry, if you don't have to give that answer if you don't know. What's she trying to describe? She's right, she's spot on. What's the word?
Voluntary.
It's voluntary. Now it gets adopted by loads of people, but then they work out it costs money and they don't want to do that to the rich people because they don't want to pay taxes. Your example is Ormskirk. They adopt it when they've got cholera, and then immediately afterwards go, this is really expensive. And a bunch of what we call ratepayers, that is people that pay taxes, the middle class, decide that it's too expensive and they'd rather not have taxes, thank you very much, and maybe they don't need this after all, and so they get rid of it. So loads of people do it, then they decide they can't afford it, they get rid of it, and it means that they have to repass it in 1875. There is also the Sanitary Act of 1866 because they try to sort of say, oh, well, maybe we won't force you to do it because that's a bad idea. Who tries to stop the government forcing people to do it? This should all be in red, really. Who tries to stop the people, the government doing this? Which group says, you know what, the government shouldn't be doing this. If I want to keep a pet dung heap, I should be able to keep a pet dung heap. That's literally a quote, by the way. That's a fun little noise. It's in your card sorts. We did one with, I think it was blue, yellow and pink cards. I might have put green in there. And there were hazards, but there were also explanations. And I think it was in pink. I'm fairly certain this one's in pink. Which group of people tried to stop the government from forcing local government to...
Is it the laissez-faire one?
Oh, it's to do with laissez-faire, yes. Laissez-faire is French for leave alone. And the government had that attitude at the beginning. And you might have noticed that laissez-faire, the government leaving things to their own devices, is what we've seen in both previous boxes. Laissez-faire is nothing new. It's just got a new name. So I'll write that down here. It's just, now it's the official policy of government until, yeah, I don't know, I suppose 1876.
Please,
Go on.
can you move the board down a bit, please?
You beg your pardon?
Could you move it down a bit, please?
Oh, the camera, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's not laissez-faire. There's a
Is
group
it
of
the
people.
dirty party?
It's the dirty party. Who are mainly what we would now term Tories, but not Conservative Party politicians, because the Conservative Party, as we understand it, doesn't quite exist yet. And they are mainly Tories. And they argue that no one should be forced to pay taxes. Basically, if poor people don't force change, is what I've written. If poor people can't afford it, why should they pay for it? Izzy?
You know where it says sewers run by that LA, what does that stand for?
Local authority.
Oh, right, okay, thank you.
And you've reminded me, there's still one thing missing. It's not just sewers that are run by the local authority. What else do they have to run? It's not just getting rid of waste. So, let me tell you a story. In Carlisle, where I grew up, they discovered a fountain on the edge of the river that runs through the town. And they discovered that it had been created by a local noble, a local member of the gentry, in the early 1700s for the use of people living on the river. And it was a gift. And it had a little statue to the guy that made it. And it had a little sort of alcove where everyone would go. And it bore his name, saying it was free for use by the poor. Basically, it made him look good. And it tasted faintly of onions. And that was the only water that was available for everyone living in that area of Carlisle, unless you took it from the river directly, which wasn't the best. And he did it to make himself look good. It later transpired that the reason for the onion taste in the water was because of significant lead deposits in the ground behind, i.e., if you drank that water too much, you'd end up dead. The rich person didn't drink from the water. He'd got his little statue there. It got so bad that it was abandoned. And in the early 1800s, well, not the early 1800s, in 1875, it was abandoned for the last time. And it lay undiscovered until the 1980s, where they found it again, tidied it up, took out all the lead, put in wild garlic to keep the onion taste. No, I'm not even joking. And it ran up until the early 2000s, where local ne'er-do-wells and vandals essentially destroyed the pipes. And now it's unfit for humans to drink unless you want to die. So they had to fence it off. But why did it get abandoned in 1875? Why did people stop using it? They'd been using it since the 1700s and they knew it killed them. So why did they suddenly stop using it in 1875?
Did it become the government's responsibility to make sure that the local authority could provide fresh water?
Correct. Local authority, sewers run by local authority, plus fresh water. This is what Emily was saying about building reservoirs last lesson. This is where they do it. And the spelling of reservoir is really annoying. So I'll just add it in the corner over here. I hate the spelling of reservoir. It's a stupid word. But there you go. That's how you spell it. Used to really annoy me when I was your age. And that's it. That's one lot. We've still got problems. Slums still exist. Oh, how else do we know there are still problems with living conditions? Not just that slums still exist. What's our proof that the government doesn't solve everything here? There's still work to be done. I'll put a date. This might help. 1899 to 1901. What's going on then?
Boer War.
It's the Boer War. And why is that relevant?
Is it because they need to be like in fighting condition, like for the war, and they're not because they're like ill and stuff?
Do you remember the percentage? You're good, by the way. That's
40.
40% of recruits were simply unfit to fight. And if the government said, well, public health isn't our job, they'd never said that war wasn't their job. They were quite keen on war. This means if they want to keep their job in war, they're going to have to look after public health as well. That's why that's relevant. And it proves that everything they've done, no matter how good it is, still hasn't worked fully, not yet. I mean, there's more. There's loads of stuff they do. You can really throw it in there. I mean, you can talk about working conditions, the 1802 Public Factory Acts. You could talk about housing acts. This is just a very, very brief overview to prove a point. The government actually start doing things and why they start doing things. Oh, by the way, who was the guy that came up with the idea of keeping data that would be used by Snow and made it a law? 1836. My favourite fellow. He always gets forgotten about. He's not too close. That was a hint. It's a really bad hint, but it was still a hint. No? Well, I'll add him in then. 1836. Your other fellow is William Farr. See, not too near. I thought it was funny. And he came up with births, marriages, and deaths being recorded. And that became law to do so. So that everyone had to record what people died of, when they died, when they were born, and when they were married. The marriage bit doesn't concern us here, but people being born and people dying, that's really useful from a public health perspective, because it means you can start spotting trends. Oh, lots of people are dying over here at a very young age. Maybe there's something we can do about that. Whereas before you wouldn't necessarily know. I mean, I'm sure the locals did, but the government didn't.
Sir, this isn't about like, the epidemics, but in 1834 I wrote down about workhouses. Yep,
that would count. That's a public health issue because they're trying to look after poor people. And you've got the poor laws in the early modern era as a precursor to that, which I didn't mention, but you're right. We did it in the Elizabethans. You can always cross-pollinate and shove it in here as well. It works both ways. So yes, absolutely, you're right. It's a good thing to write in. I've run out of space, but by all means add it if you've got space. That's what I mean. There's loads of stuff you can write down, absolutely loads. I'm only doing a bare minimum because I'm painfully aware of time. Okay. Am I okay to move off this box? Don't forget it's recording. You can come back to it later. It's really bad that I'm taking silence as consent. It's bad, is that, in terms of politics? Let's tip upwards. I think that works. To this box, let's talk about food and diet. And once again, we can split by class. So let's start with the working class. Why am I not starting with peasants? Why am I not mentioning peasants this time around? I mention them every other time round. Why not this time? I'm assuming you can still hear me. Why am I not mentioning peasants? What does this imply about what's happened? Where have they gone?
Because there are no peasants.
Well, there are, but there's a teeny tiny group. We don't care about them anymore. They're not relevant. They're out there on the farms, but there aren't many of them anymore. There's like, there were 40%.
Oh,
sorry, go on.
Is that because of the agricultural revolution?
absolutely is. Combined with the Industrial Revolution, peasants ceased to be a thing. They all moved to towns and cities, which might be worth mentioning, but probably not in this box. I don't know. Know it in the background. Maybe we'll mention it here when we talk about housing conditions. I don't know. It's not really health of the nation. It's something to know. You're not wrong, lady. You're spot on. So let's talk about working class diets. What do they eat? They're living in towns and cities, so they can't live off the land. They can't grow things in their own gardens because, well, they don't have gardens. More on that at the moment. So what do they eat?
Or like rotten meat.
If they eat any meat is low quality. And then in brackets, even rotten before 1876. Because it's really expensive and they don't have the money. What else do they eat? Because they don't eat a lot of meat. But then when they were peasants, they didn't either. So what do they eat?
Breads.
Sorry?
Breads.
Yep, they eat bread, but they don't eat breads this time around. Bread has changed. What bread do they eat now? They don't eat rye bread anymore. What are they eating? What kind of bread? Don't worry, we didn't write this down, but I'm sure you can figure it out.
Isn't it just like brown bread? Because that was quite cheap.
Spot on. It's cheap brown bread. Sometimes mixed with sawdust to make it go further. They don't know that, but it is. Depends on the baker, I suppose. What else do they eat? They eat much in the way of veg.
And don't they like have very, very little veg?
Yeah, little veg. I mean, they eat some because it's cheap.
And also, like, isn't their diet worse now than it was in the Middle Ages?
Brilliant. Yeah. That's a comparison. Let's do that in red. Arguably, worse diet. All right, MA for Middle Ages. You can do the same in an exam, by the way. Arguably. They're eating different things. For a start, they're not eating pottage anymore. And their bread sometimes gets beefed out with sawdust, which is definitely worse than the Middle Ages. But there are fewer famines, so they're not dying while eating bark to stay, full. So the diet is generally worse, but it's more regular. So I guess they're healthier, but only just. After 1876, things improved mightily. They do get other things that they might not have got. Certainly thinking about where we are in the Midlands, certainly thinking about Derby and Nottingham. What did the denizens and residents of Derby and Nottingham start eating for the very first time? Because they can.
Like fish and stuff.
Indeed, not just river fish, but sea fish. Why? Why can they eat it for the very first time? What new innovation between 1750 and 1900 means that people can eat sea fish regardless of where they are in the country?
They
They worked out a way to transport fish without keeping it from going off.
Not really. They've always known how to do that. You pack it with ice. It lasts as long as the ice does.
Oh, like new modes of transport to,
Go on.
like, I don't know, just
What quick
Railway.
transport means that Ashbourne can have a fish and chip shop selling haddock.
like the railway.
The railway, absolutely. Refrigeration comes at the end of the era, but not for the working class. But railways really, really transform things. That also will improve meat because it can get there without going off. What are the middle class? Oh, what do they drink? Sorry, missed a bit.
Don't they like drink beer and ale?
Yeah, they still drink beer and ale, but also
And milk.
beer, ale. Yeah, they do drink milk. Not a huge amount yet. That's a big deal. I'll put it in brackets. That's a big deal from 1900 onwards, and we'll come on to that. They drink something else because they can't always afford beer and ale. Indeed, lots of people say that drinking too much is bad for you, and they believe it. And lots of rich people say the poor shouldn't be drinking any alcohol. They've got other things to spend their money on. So what do they end up with?
Spirits.
Sorry?
Spirits.
Nope, they can't afford spirits. Things like the Gin Act put paid to that.
Like water?
Yeah, they drink the water, which turns out to be deadly. Almost like they already knew that. And now they're forced to drink it. Oops. It's wonderful when you moralise about people less well off than yourselves and then go, oh, maybe we've caused more problems here. What about the middle classes? I'm not going to mention the nobility. They're still there, but they're tiny and we don't have to care about them. What about the middle classes? What are they?
Don't they like drink gin and like ales and spirits?
Gin, spirits, ales. Yeah, that's their drinking. And they drink a lot, especially Edwardians. They're the worst. They drink incredible amounts.
Did they eat more veg but not boiled?
More veg, but boiled. So again, that's rabbit food. What do they eat most of? What do they tend to eat?
Meat?
Yeah, meat. Why? Well, they can afford it. My favourite is the duck stuffed with quail, stuffed with guinea fowl, stuffed with egg in blood sauce, which is an insane thing. They also, you can go further, you can stuff the duck into a chicken, you can stuff the chicken into a turkey, and you can stuff the turkey into a goose, which they also eat. So when you slice it, you've got little layers of meat. And
Can you get that? Like, in theory, could you still do that?
Yeah.
Oh, God, but no.
I mean, you can wrap it in bacon if you really want to. Hunter's chicken is a good one. What you do is you take your chicken breast, hack it off the bone, wrap it in cheese, and then wrap the cheese in bacon, and then you cook the whole thing.
That sounds so nice.
It is. And if you really want to go for it...
You never had Hunter's chicken?
Yeah, I have.
She's just hungry. So yeah, but my point being that they're eating a lot of stuff. Whose diet are they copying? Who are they trying to live
The
like?
rich and the royalty.
From when?
Um,
Look at your notes. When is this like?
Agricultural revolution.
What? No. It's very like the diets of when. When were which rich? They are.
Early modern.
Yeah, early modern. And medieval nobility. Right down to the point of having multiple courses. And having servants cooking their food. It's almost like the middle class looked back and went, we want to live like the rich people lived, and then did. So yeah, that's where all that comes from. Eating to excess. I don't think there's very much more to add there, apart from the fact that they can get more foods. I mean, the railways allow for sea fish. They also do for the middle classes as well, and fresher meat in towns and cities. It allows people to live in towns and cities. And fresh water means you don't have to drink alcohol. So you end up with rich people and poor people alike, through religious reasons, not drinking huge amounts of alcohol, something called the Temperance movement, which I thought add up. That means Temperance movement was don't drink alcohol because it makes you drunk, which is not wrong. And they say, therefore, avoid all alcohol. And you can now because you can get fresh water, which wasn't an option earlier in history. Aware of time. How are we? We're okay with that?
wait, what's the temperance movement again?
So the Temperance movement is a group of religious people. They tend to be Methodists, but there's also others, Baptists, for example, Christian denominations. And they argue that you shouldn't drink. If you want to serve God, you want to be close to Jesus, it's better if you're sober. And so their argument is fresh water is now available. We no longer have to drink alcohol so we don't die. So therefore, don't drink alcohol. And they also believe that doing the work of God in saving the poor from themselves, because the poor don't drink, maybe they won't be poor anymore.
But don't they drink wine? Because that was like Jesus.
Methodists and Baptists don't.
Oh, right.
Alcoholic wine. Jesus may have blessed the wine, but all of that is that their argument is it's not the alcohol he was blessing, it's the grape juice. It's a symbol. You don't have to drink wine. It's not actually Jesus's blood. It's a symbol of Jesus's blood. This was a point of contention because no one really knew. And during the, what do they call it, the schism, when you've got the wars of religion in the 1600s, the Protestant faith said, it's just a symbol. And the Catholics, who had, to this point had said, we don't really know, it's a mystery, went, fine, you say it's a symbol, it's actually the blood of Christ now, in retaliation. It's all a bit weird. Even now, Catholics believe that the wine is changed somehow, something they call transubstantiation, but I'm drifting wildly from the point now. But yes, Methodists and Baptists have non-alcoholic wine, sometimes even just grape juice. And one church I went to once did it with cordial, just, you know, apple and blackcurrant, so it was the right colour. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. I guess it makes sense. Are we okay to move on? Is there anything I've missed? Okay, let's move on. Final box. If I do that and then point down a bit, there we go. Final corner, this corner. How did housing conditions differ for different groups? I'll get rid of 40% limits there. I'll get rid of that. Sneaking suspicion I'm going to need more space. So the groups we need to look at, we no longer need to, well, we do need to look at the countryside, but they're not peasants. Who are they? Who lives in the countryside now?
Working class.
We don't call them working class. No, not in the countryside.
Oh.
Who's still out there? Who's still growing food? That kind of gives the game away, I hope.
Farmers.
It's farmers! In the cities, we've got the working class, which I'll shorten to WC. Note the line, the forward slash. Otherwise, if I just do dots, it becomes a water closet, which is a form of toilet. So I'll put a forward slash for working class. You can do it without the forward slash and just have WC together. Just remember they've got to be in caps. The other group I need to focus on? Working class, farmers, only because, you know, we need to mention it.
Middle class.
It's the middle classes. There we go. So let's start with farmers because it's easy and won't take us very long. What do farmers now live in? What have they started using? We said that peasants were still living in hovels the last time we looked at this, and we said that rich people were living in manors and mansions. These people live in neither, but you know what they live in. You've seen it. What do farmers live in? They're everywhere. It's simpler than you think. Trust me, it's really easy.
Cottages.
Sorry?
Cottages.
Yeah, basically, well, I was going to say farmhouses, but yeah, you've got the right idea. What are they made out of?
Brick.
Brick. Brick built. Multiple floors. Plus outhouses, barns and stuff. And this is when you start getting those becoming the norm, because all farms get bigger because of the Industrial Revolution, not the Industrial Revolution, so I'll put due to, that's an arrow, it's the Agricultural Revolution. Basically new technology like tractors, threshing machines and railways means that you can do this more easily. You can transport the materials to build the houses more easily, and you can build the houses more easily, and you've got more fields, so you can build your barns bigger. Working class in the towns, what do they live in? We've already kind of hinted at this. For the most part, what do they live in?
Slums.
Yeah, slums. What hasn't changed is how they live in those slums. So it's the same as the early modern era, and arguably the middle. This is the urban poor in the medieval era, I guess, as well. How do they live in those slums?
Crowded.
Oh, yeah, all right, it's more crowded than ever, but yes, it's always been crowded. Not the point I was driving at, but perfectly
Is
valid.
it rented rooms?
Yeah, rented rooms. One per family. One major change is what they keep in those rooms. We know evidence in places like Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, Liverpool.
Beds?
Sorry?
Beds?
No, they don't have beds. There's no space for a bed.
Isn't there like a mass migration to other cities due to the agricultural revolution?
There is.
So like slums are quickly built by factory owners on the cheap built houses.
Good. So the slums, that's why we use the term slum. You're dead right. You've explained why slums are slums. But what do the working classes bring with them into those slums, into those single room houses? They don't have much furniture. Generally speaking, they have straw on the floor that they sleep on. And if they're really lucky, they'll have a fireplace, but oftentimes they don't even have that. If they're in a basement room, it'll likely be damp, so they'll put something like an old door over the dampest part so that they don't get wet. But they also bring something else with them, because you can't buy it unless it's, rotten. And they're used to keeping these. They don't have pets, so what do they have?
Animals?
Yeah, they bring an animal. And that is a change. It's different to what's gone before. Because people in towns and cities would have had a yard to keep a pig. Well, now they don't. They keep them in the same room. So you're in a single room, topping and tailing. That means sleeping with your siblings' feet next to your head and their head next to your feet. Whilst your parents are, creating the next generation. And a pig. What a lovely time that is. What a time to be alive. How do they get the water? They're in a slum. How do you get your water? You can't get it in the house. You're in a room.
There's like a water pump.
Yeah, there's a standpipe with a water pump outside, which you better hope isn't infected or cracked beneath the surface with your cesspit. Why do you have a cesspit? Where do you get rid of your waste? Again, you're only in one room.
Isn't there like only one? There's like no toilets.
So
or like there's one toilet for a large number of people.
593 is the example in Manchester, if you want to throw that in. But yeah, there's no toilets. So where do you throw your waste away? Human beings create an incredible amount of waste. Go on, Aoife.
In the street.
In the street, in open sewers. And when that sewer gets blocked by a dead cat or rat and it rains, if you're in a basement apartment, I guess it leaks into your house with your pig sleeping on the floor with a door covering the dampest bit or a hole dug in just so all the damp leaks somewhere. Lovely. What about the middle classes? What do they live in?
Like big townhouses.
Well, they're not called townhouses. You are right, townhouses exist.
Don't they like live in like villas?
Good. They call them villas. And I was wandering around over the weekend when it was lovely weather in Ilkeston, and I noticed that every other house that is named is something villas. What's special about villas? What are they made out of? What's the primary building material?
Brick.
It's brick. Brick built, multiple floors. Multiple rooms. And what else do they include?
Like, wasn't there like piped water?
Oh yeah.
And private toilets.
Piped water. Outside toilets, of course. Inside toilets were considered filthy.
Didn't they also have gardens?
Good. Gardens for their own use, which were fenced off. In fact, if you wander around, you'll still see the remains of some railings. They were taken away in the Second World War. But if you look on a lot of old brick-built garden walls, you'll find the nubs, the stubs of iron railings in places like Derby, probably in Belper too, though Belper's a weird one because I haven't seen too much. The influence of the struts is strong. I haven't seen as much competition between the working class and the middle class in Belper. People seem to have been better off generally, and as a consequence there are fewer railings in the first place, because it turns out when people get along, you don't have to worry about people robbing your house. What else do they have? I've noticed a lot in Ilkeston. I haven't noticed it as much in Derby. I did notice it in Nottingham though. About the size of the houses with these multiple floors, multiple rooms. Why are there bits, well, if you remember I've talked about my house before, why is there a bit out the back of my house that's not as well built as the rest of it?
Like extensions?
It was an extension, but it was built at the same time, so why wasn't it built as well? Who was that for?
Like servants and...
Servants' quarters, indeed. That's who cooks all my food. That's why you can have those massive meals. You've got cooks. The apostrophe for servants' quarters comes after the S because it's owned by all of the servants. Or rather, it's for all of the servants. They don't own it. It's owned by the family they work for. Excellent. I'm sure there's more I can add. Is this sufficiently different from what was going on in the early modern era? Do you think? Or is it pretty much the same?
Most of it's the same, apart from like the government responses.
Yeah, indeed. The middle class, their living conditions, there's more of them because they're building more. That's the new bit. But in many ways, it's the same as the rich people were living in the towns, the middling sort, were living in the towns in the early modern era towards the end there. A lot of this was already there. Or rather, the idea was already there. They just built new stuff. And
poor and like for like all the poor and the working class, which era would you say they had it worst for housing?
now that is a good question. I don't have an easy answer for you. It depends on your opinion, like most things in history. If you're going to make comparisons here, you could argue that the combination of the awful diet, the awful working conditions, and the awful living conditions, I'd say we're probably looking at the worst of it now. But you could make an argument that it's worse in the early modern era because the houses are that much less secure and more likely to burn down. And you could make an argument that it's even worse in the Middle Ages because life is even tougher because they're working the land. So although the work might be easier, for different definitions of easy, I guess, there's more likelihood of starving to death through famine. So, and then you've got the modern era. People have access to all the food, but they're dying of different diseases, and arguably get blamed more for their own choice, well, things that they can't really choose. So, and we're seeing that a lot with the COVID lockdown rules and people saying, well, that's why these groups of people are dying more, it's their own stupid fault. And yeah, you could argue that that's worse because they're not being trusted as much or seen as ordinary human beings. In other words, there's an argument to be made for every single era, that being the worst time to live as a poor labourer. And it's up to your own decision making as to which one you would see as worst. It's an opinion.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, my argument is this one, but that's very much my argument, very much a me thing. I think, looking at the time, I've covered everything. Is there anything I've missed or you want to add? Now is the time to do it. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. There we go. If you want to ask